I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is made crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness, and to know folly. And I perceive this is also but striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. Thanks for allowing us to come together and explore your word. Thank you for the book of Ecclesiastes. I want to pray right now today as we look at an aptly titled sermon series called The Good Life, how we could find the good life. Lord, I pray right now for anyone here who's not a believer, Lord, whether in here or watching online, Lord, that you speak to them and that they come to know you. Jesus, I thank you and I love you. In your name I pray. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. So, as I'm sure you're well aware, last week we started our sermon series. It'll be our main sermon series of the year, the book of Ecclesiastes. And something I forgot to explain last week was why we titled it The Good Life. In fact, if you've read Ecclesiastes, or if you've been here last year, or if you were just listening over the past 45 seconds, maybe you've come to the conclusion or the feeling that the good life isn't something that the writer of Ecclesiastes is talking about. Right? I would argue it is. Here's the big thing about Ecclesiastes, right? The book of Ecclesiastes was written by a very wise man, a king. We have a good idea of who it is at the end of his life, and he's dejected because he wasted his life in all of these different pursuits that we can only dream of doing and pursuing. And he comes to the conclusion that everything is temporary and everything is meaningless. And you're like, how is that a good life, Larry? I'm glad you asked. Because what we're going to see is how, as believers, how we can find and live what the good life is by avoiding the pitfalls that this man before us has taken. You know, the good life is an interesting thing. It's something that if you've been to college, if you've been in a philosophy class, it's something that people talk about a lot. Or if you've been in a sociology class, what makes a good life? What makes a life well lived? What makes a good life for the public? What makes a good life for your home? And something that we see, that we talk about a lot, it's something that follows a lot of different classes, is the idea of, well, if I can be wise enough, if I can have enough wisdom, and we'll get into what that is, surely that can lead the good life. That could lead to the good life. If I make wisdom my center, if I make wisdom my all, applied knowledge, that will set me on the right track. And what we see in our text today, this is the main idea of our sermon, is that, and I had like 4 of them, so I don't know which we went with, it's simply this: you cannot escape Havel with wisdom. Right? Now, if you weren't here last week or you didn't tune in, you're like, what in the world is Havel? I'm glad you asked. So if you've got your Bible open, there's this word that gets used, I think, 73 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. That word is vanity. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, says the preacher. And you're like, what's vanity? The Hebrew word for that is Havel. Okay? So to reiterate what vanity is, it literally means your breath, right? Have you ever been outside shoveling or wised up and got a snowblower and you breathe and you see that mist come out, right? That's not one breath, that's several breaths. How short that is, how vapid that is, literally, how temporary that is, that's what Havel is. And the big idea that the preacher is getting after last week and this week is that everything under the sun is short. And you go later on and he kind of constructs it. He goes, everything, it's not just that it's short, it's seemingly meaningless. It's cruel. It doesn't make any sense. I try and make sense of life itself, and it doesn't. Vanity of vanities, or Havel of Havel, or meaningless of meaningless, or absurdities or absurdities. Everything is absurd, says the preacher. And we get into our text today, and you're like, why did I get out of bed for this? Hang with me, I promise. It gets a little worse before it gets better, but I promise it's good. What happens is we pitch and we're like, all right, if I can outthink, if I could outwise, if I could memorize all of Aesop's fables, if I could command the 10 commandments, if I could do the Sermon on the Mount, then the bad life is going to miss me and the good life is going to hit me. And what we see here in our text is this king over Israel that we'll talk about a lot in a few minutes. He did the wisdom thing. And lo and behold, even if you're wise, you cannot escape Havel. Your breath, it expires. So true happiness isn't found in wisdom. The good life isn't found just in wisdom. Now, we're going to talk about that a lot. We're going to see two things. I want to talk about wisdom. We're going to talk about what wisdom cannot do and what wisdom can do. Here's the outline, all right? This is not original from me. There's a commentary that I've been working with a lot called the Reform Exegetical Commentary. It's a fantastic commentary. He views everything through the lens of Christ, but he outlines it this way, and I'm borrowing it. It says, wisdom cannot change reality. That's the first half of the text. You can be as wise as you want to be. You're not Thanos. You cannot make reality be whatever you want it to be. But what wisdom does do is wisdom does increase sorrow. That's this twofold truth that the preacher is teaching today. And there's important things we can pull from that and ways we can live our lives in light of that do, in fact, bring fulfillment and happiness. Let's go ahead and start. Wisdom does not change reality. So, as we kick off our text today, if you've got your Bible, you start in verse 12. The preacher is going to start this idea regarding wisdom and folly and excess and hard work. And he starts here, and he goes all the way through to chapter 2, all of chapter 2. I think there's 26 verses. And what happens is there's this theme of wisdom that the preacher is going to put to bed this week, next week, I think the following week, and I think I lumped in hard work with wisdom, but at least the next 3 weeks. Right? So it's really important to talk about what wisdom is because you've opened it, and if you've just heard us talking about wisdom thus far, your thought might be, well, Larry, you must think that wisdom is for the birds. Only stupid people are wise, right? That's not at all. Let's talk about what wisdom is as we get into this, okay? So wisdom, a lot of times when we talk about wisdom, we talk about kind of a morality thing, right? It's the idea here of what truth is and what to do with it, right? So, the wise person doesn't cheat on his or her math test, right? Because they'll get found out. The wise person practices his or her instrument at home before he or she goes back to school. A lot of student analogies here because this is what I see on my bus a lot, right? And you're like, it's funny because like every semester somebody learns if they don't practice, they still have to do a band concert. And there's that whole thing, right? Wisdom tells you to do the thing, right? It's like that, but it's a little bit more when you look at it in the Bible. A good way to think about wisdom is capacity of mind, what you're able to think about and retain in your knowledge, right? Children, by nature, aren't wise because they don't know a lot. They don't know what to do with the little information that they have, right? If you want to hear an unwise kid, get like a 6-year-old to tell you a joke, right? It's knock, knock, who's there? Potatoes. And you're like, right? Or I get this a lot on my bus. They'll be like, Mr. Larry, want to hear a joke? And I'll be like, yeah. And then I'll hear giggling, and they'll be like, ha, 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 ha. And that's it. That's not a joke. That's not wise. You need wisdom to make a good joke, right? It's capacity of mind. And what happens is it's not just having a bowl of information in your head. It's knowing from that information how to live your life. And what's really cool is that ethics and morality is inextricably tied to wisdom. If you don't have wisdom, you don't know what good morals is. All you know how to do is regurgitate what you've been taught. We do that a lot with young kids, don't we? It's not don't put your hand in the stove because you could burn yourself, right? Even though that's true. It's if my hand goes near that stove, my mom's going to snap me with a wooden spoon, right? That's better than the burning, right? And by the way, if they get by you, they learn that lesson real quick, right? That's what wisdom is. And as we go through, wisdom is this key theme all throughout the Bible. It's this good gift to have, and it's especially focused on in the book of Ecclesiastes, in Psalms, and in this book called Proverbs. It's kind of the companion book to Ecclesiastes, right? And what happens is wisdom is this thing. It's this gift that God gives to everybody to seek out. Let me read what the Bible has to say about wisdom. It has a lot to say. I picked the shoulder of the verses over in Proverbs 4. He's Solomon, of all people, we'll get into that in a minute, is writing. He says, "Hear, O sons, a teaching. When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the side of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast to my words, keep my commandments, and live." Right? Wisdom and not dying, there's a direct link between those things. And he goes, listen, get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget. Don't turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her wisdom. She will keep you. Love her. That's wisdom. And she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom, whatever you can get. Get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place your head on she will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. All right? Wisdom is a good thing and a good gift from God, okay? You're like, Larry, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. Let me let this whole thing breathe, okay? All right? What happens is the problem that we get into is when we seek wisdom at the center of our life for all happiness. If I know enough, if I read enough books. That's my problem. There's a whole thing about that at the end of Ecclesiastes, right? If wisdom's my God, that's going to make me happy. And the king, let's get into the text here, the preacher, he experienced this. He goes, I, the preacher, I've been king over Israel and Jerusalem. There's this really interesting thing because some of us, our wildest dreams is to have the authority of like a president, right? Or a king or something like that. Not necessarily for the decisions that you have to make, but like for the title. I remember when I was a kid, I was like, hey, my dad wasn't around, and I was like 5, so I was like, I can't wait to be a mom someday so I can stay up. And she's like, no, it's a dad. Boys are dads. I'm like, oh, okay. Can't wait to be a dad sometime. And then I got a little bit older, and I was like, I can't wait to be a boss someday. I can call all the shots. And I remember when I was a youth pastor, I was like, I can't wait to be a pastor someday. All my problems are going to go away when I'm a pastor in church life, right? That sense of authority, that's like the be-all, end-all. And this guy with wisdom, that's his starting point. So he has the liberty to do all these things that he's about to say. What does he say? He goes, with the resources of being a king of a country, I applied my heart to seek and search out the wisdom of all that's done under heaven. Okay? Now, there's this really important word here, and it's the word all. Here's the thing that happens when you become sophomoric in your life. You know, that word sophomore, that's second year in school, whether it's high school or college. It literally means wise fool, right? Sophia, wise, moranos, fool, right? Or moron, right? And, you know, what happens is as you get older, and if you have kids, you know, like if you have older kids, you know this, there's what you teach them, and then they get to a point in their lives where they see other things and it's different from what you've taught them. Right? And you guys ever had that thing where you raise your kids to believe one thing and they believe something else? Right? You guys ever have that thing where you're debating with them on something? It always winds up being politics. And they bring up a good point that you haven't necessarily thought of yet, but you have to dismiss it because it's not your worldview. Right? Nobody? Oh, man, okay, just me. Okay, that's fair, I'll be honest. You guys don't have to be honest, I will, all right? What happens is, what Solomon does is he learns, spoilers, he learns the Torah, he learns the wisdom books, he learns the law, and then he steps outside of Judaism, and he learns all this other wisdom, right? There's this very important truth that you need to understand when it comes to truth. All truth, if it is truth, is indeed God's truth, okay? Nope. Thank you, hon, right? It is a very important thing. Let me ask you this. Is something not true when somebody you don't like says it? No, of course it's true, right? We live in this really weird tribalistic time to where when we find people from other tribes saying things that we believe, we shift our beliefs because they can't be right. That's not how truth or wisdom works, right? You know, what's interesting is there's this old document called the Code of Hammurabi that was put up by a king, not an Israelite, in the same general time frame, a couple hundred years either way. And there's a lot of things he says about like the rights of slaves and servants that we would agree with and that the Bible would agree with. Why? Because that's God's truth, even if it's spoken from Hammurabi, right? Does everybody understand that? We all get that. Okay. So what happens is, what Solomon does is he checks his background. And we'll get into why we think it's Solomon in the next point. The preacher, he checks his background. And then he goes outside and he cross-references with neighboring countries. And he gets all the wisdom. And then what happens is we get to this next verse, or this next sentence, and here's his assessment of wisdom in and of itself. Wisdom, if it's just its own thing, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. The word unhappy, the Hebrew word actually means evil. It's not that God is giving us sin, but what happens is the world that we live in is a broken world. And Solomon, the preacher, after he works with the law, and he works with the Torah, and he works with the Old Testament, and he goes over and he works with the stuff, and he looks at all these different kingdoms, what wisdom tells him is that things are awful everywhere. And wisdom doesn't change that fact. He just understands it more. This is this really important thing. I didn't have an illustration for this, but now we're going to get to it in a minute. Actually, it'll go well with my other thing. What happens then is wisdom bad? No. What he's learning is that wisdom tells you what to do with the information, what to do with the world around you. It doesn't change the world around you. All right. Something that I have a chip on my shoulder with oftentimes is like contemporary Christian music. Part of it is because I grew up in Seattle and I'm kind of like in the worst kind of way a hipster. So I'm like, you've heard of that band? I can't say I like it anymore, right? The other part is because I feel a lot of times Christian music, when it's sung, the word is vapid. It's very light. It's misty, you know. There's a song that I've been listening to a lot, actually, and it's not that I got convicted about this, but there's this very real thing. It says, I've got so much to be thankful for. Look, I've got a roof and a bed. I've got a couple groceries to stay fed. I've got a phone and clean water, and I've got some shoes to go further. Today I've got so much to be thankful for. Hey, I woke up this morning thinking, thankful, Lord, for giving me everything I could ever need and more. I've got so much to be thankful for. Okay, so I like that. I sing that. That's true for me. I own a bed. I have groceries. We can tell that I'm pretty well fed, right? I do own a phone, right? I have clean water, and I do have shoes. I have multiple pairs, right? You know what's crazy is, like, right around the corner at Brook Park Elementary, there are families and children who do not have those things, right? Today we prayed about the Christians and non-Christians in Angola, right? And, like, to put it lightly, y'all, that was a bummer, right? But, like, realistically, I can be as wise as I want to be. That doesn't change those facts about not only our friends and neighbors who live in the greater Brook Park, Berea, Middleburg Heights area, but also people across the world. You know, a lot of times we call it the third world, right? Most sociologists I know call it the majority world, right? Child prostitution is very sadly common across the world, right? Drug use and gangs is sadly incredibly common across the world. And what happens is we get back to this, and the preacher understands this, and he gives us this little proverb. He says, what is crooked can't be made straight. Some of your versions may have the word twisted. Think of trying to straighten out a tornado. You can't do it. And this is why I wanted to quote this song, the back half of this proverb, that what is lacking, it can't be counted. You can't outwise yourself from the world because of what the world is. And you're like, Larry, why would God give us this world like this? It's not so much that God gave us this world. It's that we're living in the world that we created. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, if you read the Bible back in Genesis, God creates everything out of nothing, ex nihilo, right? For his glory, right? So cows cow, and by cowing, those cows glorify God. That's really cool. Rocks rock, right? Especially if there's an earthquake and they're kind of circular. But in being a rock, they glorify God because they're doing what they're created to do. God created everything out of nothing to glorify him. The chief of creation is mankind, us, you and I, Adam and Eve, right? What happens is God created us special in his image, the Imago Dei, so we could have a relationship with him and we can glorify him. But there is not a caveat, but there is one rule that God had when he created everything, especially for us people. And what's that? It's do not sin. Do not disobey the Lord your God. There is do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Adam and Eve, they eat that and they sin against the Lord. And the world, as a result of that, becomes cursed. And we think, oh, well, there's drug dealers. It's not just that there's drug dealers or bad people. It's that we are all tainted by this sin. The Bible teaches this idea of sinfulness making us totally depraved. That doesn't mean we're unable to do good things. When we say depravity in its totality or total depravity, our depravity reaches every inch, every square centimeter of our bodies, our thoughts, and our souls. What that means is for the rest of my life as a pastor, I always have to check my motives because as godly as I'm ever going to get as a pastor, I'm still going to have sinful motives, right? That's true for everybody in this room. And what happens is it's not just that we become sinful, it's that we're removed from God. And it's not just that we're removed from God and we're sinful, it's that we sin against other people and then they pick up the backlash and they pick up the consequences of our sin. Something I'm really thankful for is my wife thanks me a lot for working, right? 2 jobs. And then I always say, well, you have to say that because my wife. And then she gets really annoyed. And then she says, a lot of people will either won't work or they'll work and not bring home their paychecks, right? Can I tell you something? That's true. And that's one of the reasons why that we try and help out with Brook Park Elementary. Right? If you're just seeking wisdom and not the giver of wisdom, all you're going to find is you can't shape reality to be what you want it to be. So first we see that. Secondly, we see wisdom. What it does do on its own is it increases sorrows. So we go back, it's in verse 16, and what the preacher says, he says, I have said in my heart, he quotes, I've gathered great wisdom, surpassing all who were ever in Jerusalem before me, and my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So there's this guy, and actually I was talking to one of our future church members after church last week, because I say the preacher and not Solomon, and a lot of people think Solomon wrote this book, and he probably did, but the word Solomon's not in there, so I'm playing it safe, right? The reason a lot of people think Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes is because of his unique rise to prominence in Israel. He's one of 5 kids who could have been the rightful throne of Israel. And as a side note, if you ever want to read not a mafia, but how do I say this right? Like an HBO drama kind of tale, check out 1st and 2nd Kings. Right? Because there's all this backstabbing in place for the throne. And Solomon gets it. And what happens is there's this passage where Solomon becomes king. And I'll just read the text. It's over in 1 Kings 3. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And he said, listen, ask what I shall give for you. All right, whatever you want, Solomon, it's yours. Right? And Solomon said, you've shown great steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked in your faithfulness and righteousness and an uprightness of the heart towards you. And you've kept for him a great and steadfast love, and you've given him a son to sit on the throne this day. Now, Lord, oh, Lord, my God, you've made your servant king in place of David, my father, though I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out and come in, and your servant is in the midst of people that you've chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for the multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind or wisdom to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, who is able to govern these great people. So the Lord's like, listen, whatever you want, it's yours, right? And Solomon says, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you give me some wisdom, right? And this pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And he said, because you asked this, and you've not asked for yourself a long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, you've asked for yourself discerning what is right. Behold, I do now according to your word. Behold, you, child, you are wise and discerning in mind, and none shall be like you before you or after you, and none shall rise like you afterwards. I paraphrase that last part. Sorry about that. But what happens is we go over, and the reason we think it's Solomon is because he's talking about how he's greater than any other king before him in this text. And by the way, that's like two kings, but they're pretty notable kings. Saul, the first king, who learned not to disobey the Lord, and David, who was a pretty godly man and learned some pretty important life lessons. And Solomon says this really interesting thing. He says, listen, I acquired this great wisdom, right? Surpassing everybody before me. And my heart, and this is really important here, he goes, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So when you read the biography of Solomon, it's really interesting because he has like this really cool start. And Solomon's legacy is unparalleled in the Old Testament. They have peace the entire time he reigns. They have unparalleled prosperity, economic growth, right? In fact, there's this passage later on where one of their neighboring countries, Sheba, the queen of Sheba, she hears these stories about him. They're like, no way, this can be true. This is hyperbole. So she goes up to visit with him, and she comes away saying the half hasn't been told of how wealthy he is and how well off they are. And what happens is we see all these things, but what happens is about halfway through Solomon's biography, you see him fall off. He starts following other gods. He actually takes on, I think 700 wives and 300 concubines, or 800 wives and 200 concubines. I always get them mixed up, right? Don't think relational pursuit. Think more like collecting cars, right? And you're like, that's pretty awful. It is. You're 100% right, okay? And what happens is Solomon, in all this stuff, or the preacher here, speaking on behalf of most likely Solomon, says, I've experienced wisdom, the good stuff. But look at this next part. He goes, I also applied my heart to know not only wisdom, but also madness and folly. You know, what's funny is madness and folly. The only time madness is used in the Old Testament is in this passage, in this book, and it's talking about experiencing things just to experience them, right? You guys ever hear the phrase, don't knock it till you tried it? Right? That's our sermon title today, right? You guys ever tried it so you could knock it and regretted it? That's Solomon, man, for his entire life. You know, folly is just straight up abject sin against God, right? Think of it this way. If a good way to compare and contrast wisdom to folly and knowledge to madness are the two brothers in the story of, I'm thinking the brothers Karamazov, if that's not right. The two brothers in the prodigal son, right? You got one brother who's wise and he does everything his dad asks him and he doesn't make a whole lot of noise and he works. And they got the other brother who completely falls off the wagon and parties hard and has to come crawling back to his dad. Solomon lives both. And he can, right? And what happens is he goes, listen, I perceived that this also, the wisdom that made me miserable at the first half of this, and the folly that seems like the right move because this wisdom made me miserable, the party life, right? All it is it's striving after the wind. So what does that mean? Think of it this way. Think of trying to catch the horizon. It's the same thing. You can't do it. I remember when I was in high school, I didn't know how the earth worked, sadly. And when my grandparents took us to Hawaii from Seattle, Washington, we were just over the ocean. And I remember wanting to, but not asking my grandfather when we were going to get to the horizon. I didn't because I didn't want to embarrass myself. That's okay, right? What happens is you never get there. When you chase the horizon, all the horizon does is laugh. When you chase the wind, all the wind does is blow. When you chase wisdom for wisdom's sake in itself, all you're going to find is hurt. When you chase what he would say folly, the party life, right? Whether that, what is it? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There we go, right? You know, the big thing that everybody didn't like back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s. What happens is all you're doing is following after the horizon. You're just chasing wind. And he comes back here and he gives the second proverb, and it's really important. He says, listen, for in much wisdom, it's vexation, right? What does he mean by vexation? It's not just annoying. It's like a thumbtack in your shoe. You can't get rid of it. And he says, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Well, let's talk about that real quick. So Solomon was sorrowful because he increased in wisdom over here, and he learned about the Angolians who were starving to death. And then Solomon said, I don't want to have to do anything to do with that. I'm going to self-medicate, right? I'm going to go do the sex, drug, and rock and roll thing. And what happens is, after however long, however many wives, however many one-night stands, however much wealth, and we're going to talk about this a lot next week, lo and behold, he finds it's like trying to catch up to the horizon. And it doesn't bring happiness. And do you know what it brings instead? That wisdom from learning that it doesn't bring happiness? It brings misery. I have met and known, because I've traveled the country and I've lived in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of people who've lived the party life and who are now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. They are not happy people. Why? Because they know it doesn't bring satisfaction and there's nothing left. They know their body is spent and there's no redeeming it. And Solomon has both here. And you're like, Larry, why is this a happy thing? That's not. Let's talk about wisdom and the purpose of wisdom, okay? So what's really cool is when you go back, the companion piece. And by the way, my challenge to you is to read through the book of Proverbs. And like, if you've got a phone or if it's on a computer screen, hit Control F and just search for all the times it says wisdom. Right? Because the first thing in Proverbs 1:7, it's the first time wisdom is mentioned, right? And he says, this is the beginning of wisdom. This is the foundation of wisdom, all right? If you don't have a foundation, you're not going to have anything else. So, like, if you miss this, you're going to be very sad if all you do is not drink alcohol, okay? If you miss this, you're going to be very sad if all you do is not do the drugs, right? This is the beginning of wisdom. Fear God. And that's it. That's the proverb, right? The start of wisdom is getting to know the one who created wisdom. It's God himself. What Solomon missed here, or the preacher, because we're not 100% sure, I think it is, but we're going to try and stick with Solomon, is that he sought wisdom for wisdom's sake, kind of like I seek cheese for cheese sake at 3 a.m, right? It's a great garnish. It's a really good part of a sandwich, but man, that's not why you exist. And what happens is, if you know the Creator, you cannot change the realities. Angolia will still be there, right? But what happens is he guides you in how to live your life to where maybe you can help those people. Maybe you can pray for those people. Maybe you can pray for those people, put your head on the pillow, and have it be enough, right? What I love is that wisdom comes from God. It doesn't come from a tribe. And because of that, lasting wisdom is solid. And it doesn't move or go anywhere. You know, we're in this really weird spot. And like, this has happened a few times in the history of our countries. Of our country, or what it fundamentally means to be a Republican is different now than it was like 200 years ago, right? And it was even different from what it was, you know, back in the 1950s and 60s, right? In fact, there's this really good line in White Christmas that they had to change about how rare it was to see a Democrat up in Vermont. Like, you know, they had to change that because everybody was Republicans in Vermont back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, right? And it's fundamentally different now to be a Democrat than what it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. The sense of wisdom and truth coming from each party is shifting dramatically. And what that means is if all you're getting your wisdom from is that party or those talking people, then your values are going to shift. And the things that you cherished so hard 5 years, 10 years ago will not even be there in the next 5 years or 10 years. And what happens is, if you're a Christian, and I'm talking to Christians here, and we talked about this in Sunday school a little bit, right? What happens is you're trading the eternal wisdom from a life-giving God who died on the cross to give you full life and life abundant for the shifting sand of wisdom here that only gives you havel. It's vaporous, it's meaningless, it's short, it's cruel. It does not think of you and does not care of you, right? So what do we do with this text? Great question. I think the first thing we do as Christians is this. We cherish wisdom because it brings us closer to God. If you're seeking wisdom and missing God, you're not seeking wisdom right. I'll give an example of this. There's a guy out there, a well-known professor in Canada named Jordan Peterson. Anybody know Jordan Peterson? Okay, all right. So this is really weird thing that's happening because he really uplifts the Bible, and a lot of people have met Jesus because of Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson himself has never met Jesus himself. And you're like, yes, he has. No, he has not. I've read a lot about this. What he does is he looks at Jesus as the ultimate picture of sacrifice, and we should follow the teachings of Jesus because it teaches sacrifice, and sacrificing for your community is the best good that you could have. You know what that is? That's like Roman wisdom. That's not Christianity, right? And then you press him on it, and he gets really uncomfortable, and he starts talking about crabs, but that's like a whole different thing, right? Yeah, our sound guys know. What happens is, what Peterson's going to find is at the end of the wisdom he's seeking, he's not going to find life. He's only going to find misery, and it's not going to change the world around him. Meanwhile, there's been countless young men and young women who've heard of Jesus through Peterson, who started reading the Bible, who met Jesus. And while the world around them may or may not change, and while they may increase in sorrow because they've seen nasty things in the world, like Angola, their lives change. See, what's really great about the gospel, Jesus Christ dying on the cross, being buried, raising again, is that that's accredited to us. And it says in the New Testament, because of that, if anybody is in Jesus Christ, he is a new creation, or he is a new creature. All things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. True wisdom doesn't lead to the world changing. True wisdom leads to you changing to look more like God, and that is where we find happiness. Not anywhere else. Can you find temporary happiness? Of course. Is it lasting? I mean, not longer than your life. So the best thing you can do is seek the creator of wisdom and know God. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for you and the fact that you are the true philosophy. Everything else is a cheap knockoff. God, thank you so much for the fact that you've allowed me to come to know you. And there are great things in this world, and they shine so much more because I see them. And Lord, I've learned that knowledge increases sorrow, but it leads me to put my hope in you more. And I pray right now for our church family, Lord, who have sorrow upon sorrow. Lord, I pray right now that you be the balm of Gilead. You know, you're a balm because rashes exist. You're the great physician because diseases exist. You are hope because we are pressed down and shaken and stirred. But Lord, I pray right now that we seek our hope in you. And Lord, I pray right now that any of us who are, and this is me, seeking to outwise the world, I pray we repent of that. Jesus, thank you, and I love you. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to have a couple of stanzas, a response